So it's a pleasure to introduce our second presenter, Dr. Darin Detwiler, founder and CEO of Detwiler Consulting Group, LLC. He is also an author, columnist, consultant, academic, and food safety icon who has served in appointed or other advisory capacities for the USDA, FDA, NEHA, AFDO, and others. He is the recipient of IAFP's 2022 Ewan C.D. Todd Control of Foodborne Illness Award, as well as their 2018 Distinguished Service Award for dedicated and exceptional contributions to the reduction of risks of foodborne illness. For 3 decades, Dr. Weiler's insights and research have served as keynote presentations and in his books, Food Safety, Past, Present, and Predictions, and Building the Future of Food Safety Technology, Blockchain, and Beyond. Dr. Detwiler's work has also been profiled in many media platforms such as The Today Show and The New York Times. It's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Darin Detwiler.
Imagine being called an expert, subject matter expert in food safety, and for over 30 years, most of the phone calls you take regarding food safety are from people whose children are in one of 2 situations. They're in Children's Hospital, well, thank you, a pediatric intensive care unit suffering from hemolytic uremic syndrome, or you're talking with a parent who just buried a child from a failure in food safety. There's not too many people that want to be in that category of having those kind of conversations around food safety, and yet most people, when they talk about food safety, it's after the fact. I, as discussed, have written some books. My first book, Food Safety, Past, Present, Predictions, ended up becoming the majority of the source material for Poisoned on Netflix. So somehow we have Netflix people this morning. The producers approached me wanting to look at not only my conversation around what happened in 1993, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The events of 1993 essentially set forward our current era of food safety culture in the United States. But they wanted to focus on what happened between 1993 and present. And as a result of that, not only did I end up becoming a technical consultant for the documentary, but ended up spending so much time in front of a camera and was surprised how much ended up on the final product. And now, just recently, the documentary won an Emmy. So I think it tells you something. Thank you. I'm going to go off script again, even though I'm not even looking at a script. 30 some odd years ago, I was working on a television movie about the 1993 Jack in the Box E. coli outbreak, and a book. No publisher wanted to publish that book because they said that the American public just does not talk about food this way. And ultimately, all 3 networks that were working on doing a TV movie, it got down to 1 network, and then finally I was told that they're going to drop the project, and it was canceled because no one wants to talk about food safety in America, and because there was not enough sex or violence in the story to sell it to a mainstream American television viewing audience. And here, 30 years later, the amount of columns that I write, of chapters in books that I write, other people write around food safety and how our changing relationship with food is viewed through so many different lenses today, and the fact that here we have a documentary about food safety that won an Emmy, I think it tells us something about how as a group, our relationship with food has changed. And there's many dimensions that look at this. Oh, and by the way, as was mentioned here, when you do a Netflix documentary, yeah, you're trashed on social media, and everyone questions everything you say. And I'll have to admit, I've done so many talk tours, speaking tours after this documentary came out. Has anyone seen the documentary? Okay, I see some hands. The one thing that people always ask is that how chicken is made? There's a whole scene where they're showing the chicken industry, and a lot of shock in terms of, again, it's reflecting how we're very disconnected from our source of food. So I will preface this by saying that I'm a professor, but I also work with an industry, and I'm a historian and an engineer. So I'm going to look at some different parameters here. There's supposed to be a little bit more of a color in terms of a big arrow coming up here, but if we look at certain elements over time, we can see that everything from canning, freezing, pasteurization, our emphasis on industrial agriculture, food irradiation, there's many changes over a long period of time that we can look at that gradually pushed our food industry into what we start to see today. Along the way, though, with canning and our early failures, we have the jungle. With this, Upton Sinclair wrote about, and he was not the only one that wrote about this. If you are very interested, need to take a look at, there was a series of postcards sent around Africa because the Chicago meat canning was shipping products to the British Mercantile Association through into Africa. And by the time it got to literally being opened up for consumers, it was so putrid, it was so full of things other than meat, that there was pressure on the U.S. Department of, at the time, the State Department to do something different about this. That put together with Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, pressured the White House, the president, into really supporting this idea of the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. The Pure Food and Drug Act in 1930 became more true what we see today as the FDA. And we have other elements that were discovered along the way or initiated along the way. HACCP in the 1960s, even though it took about 30 years for it to become mainstream. Of recent, we have, again, we can look at the 1980s in terms of where we really saw the current plateau, if you will, with ready-to-eat foods. We now see hydroponics and vertical farming. I spent a significant time earlier this year in Texas working with both of those. And now with plant-based meat alternatives. In 1993, we had the Jack in the Box E. coli outbreak. This is significant. Essentially, before 1993, we never talked about E. coli. Now, we just are made aware of this issue with E. coli and onions at McDonald's. And what a lot of people don't realize is that in the 80s, there was an E. coli outbreak with their meat. But they initiated an internal plan to have these time lock mechanisms that will not allow the meats to be undercooked. In 1993, the Jack in the Box E. coli outbreak, we had over 150 people hospitalized, some 700 people became sick, but there were 4 children that died. And this captured the media's attention, and it captured the president's attention. President Bill Clinton was just inaugurated at this period of time. And he had his first televised live town hall meeting, and I had the opportunity to talk with him about what was going on from the Seattle studio. And he was now asking some questions and directed his Secretary of Agriculture to look into certain changes. About a week later, President Clinton was flying out to Seattle and was going to visit my wife and I and our son, who was at the Children's Hospital in Seattle. But unfortunately, as one could imagine, my son was one of the 4 children who died in that outbreak. And I got a call from Air Force One talking father to the President of the United States because he could not imagine going through something like this with his own daughter. And he asked me, what do we need to do about this? And at the time, I was a nuclear engineer on a submarine in the Navy. And I had a lot of quality assurance background, and so I tried to make this connection here. But ultimately, I said, look, I lost my son, but I don't want my son to ever have lost his father. I don't want to live in that universe. And so we looked at the idea of what are we going to do going forward? And what we ended up doing was, one, the USDA ended up declaring E. coli as an illegal adulterant in meat. Number two, remember how I talked about in 1906, the Meat Inspection Act? So from when the USDA started during the Civil War until sometime around 1906, there was no inspection done by the USDA. From about 1906 until the 1990s, all of the meat inspection done by the USDA was organoleptic. Anyone know what organoleptic means? It's what they could see, what they could smell, and what they could touch. In 1993, we said, you know what? There's some science that can help us with this. So the second thing was meat inspection would now become science-based. We also focused on consumer education, which was controversial at the time. If anyone has ever purchased a piece of raw meat or poultry at a grocery store, you've either seen a sticker or printed on the packaging or the price. It says cook thoroughly, refrigerate leftovers. That was the work that I did in the early to mid 1990s. Thank you very much. And I was the hated individual. How dare I tell the meat industry that there could be a problem with their meat? You buy a screwdriver and you get a page and a half of litigious warnings. Wear proper eyewear, adult supervision required. Don't use in a bathtub. But there was no warnings about meat. So we wanted to put this forward, and ultimately it got approved and has been in place since 1994. I more recently worked on mechanically tenderized beef, where they take a tough piece of meat and put 1 million or so, I don't think it's really 1 million, but they put all these needles through it to tenderize it. Well, the pathogen's on the outside. And if you put all those needles through it, guess where the pathogen goes? To the inside. And you cannot see this with the naked eye. And so in terms of food safety, now a piece of steak has to be treated as if it's ground beef. And people don't like that. They want their center of their steak to be very raw. So there had to be some kind of labeling in place. And yet again, work with the USDA. I became the hated guy in the face of the meat industry. It gets passed. And both cases, what I thought was interesting too was, we cannot afford to do this. The meat industry will never recover economically if you have us put this label on the product. Even though, for mechanically tenderized beef, the same companies in the United States were putting that label on it to sell it in Canada, and they didn't oppose it at all. But to sell that in the United States, this was going to ruin the industry. Clearly, it has not. I think one of the biggest problems, though, is that we can't think about food safety just in terms of meat and poultry. Foodborne pathogens do not discriminate. Again, McDonald's was onions. And look at how many other outbreaks we have seen that are all in terms of foods regulated by the FDA. And I'll get a little bit more specific on this in a minute. We can look at some other specific elements here, some changes even in the 1890s and the 1960s. Elements we can pinpoint in terms of moving us towards the direction. By the way, if you really want these slides, if you don't want to get a cramp in your hand, email me, or I don't know if they're going to provide these slides to people, or please take pictures. I've taken like 500 over the last 24 hours. Thank you, two presenters, by the way. We can look at even more recent changes and the movement here, even the idea of FDA approval, and right now how there is a memorandum of understanding between the USDA and the FDA because of like, well, who regulates this? Who regulates this? So that being said, in 1993, as a result of this outbreak, we saw a shift to science-based inspection, the pathogen reduction program, E. coli becoming an illegal adulterant in meat, and consumer education about food safety really taking hold in the United States, and beyond, I'm sure. But this idea of a food safety culture was taking place. The biggest problem here is that we needed to look at the FDA. Here's why. This only shows from 1992 to 2015, but the data that was being collected by the US Census Bureau had been collected long before that. They were looking at Americans' food spending patterns. And what this shows is that starting in 2015, and ever since then, Americans spend more of their food money on food that is prepared outside of the house than they do on food that's prepared in the house. And even just a simple check in terms of what you've seen in the last 5 years, the growth of food trucks, meal deliveries, third-party shopping, third-party delivery. There are so many different ways in which we get food. How many people remember the TV show The Brady Bunch? You might be wondering, what kind of a segue is this? There is a recent thing that I found fascinating. Brady Bunch is being binge-watched a great deal today by the Utes. And I get this question. Professor, you know the Brady Bunch? Yes. You know Alice? Yes. What's up with her and Sam? What do you mean with her and Sam? Well, she goes to this butcher guy. Why does she go to a butcher? Because think of the younger generation today. How many butchers do they see? Right? The idea of they went to butchers to get a piece of meat that they would take home to grind. Anyone on social media ever see those things? Hey, I found this. What is this? I want a social media, what do they call that? I want to crowdsource the answer. What is this? It's a meat grinder. Why would my great-grandma have a meat grinder in her house? We have become so disconnected from things in terms of how we used to get food that it's become significant here. But another thing to note is that with more food being prepared outside of the house, more and more and more of it is food that is regulated by the FDA, not the USDA. And if you look at the pattern of outbreaks, the rise in outbreaks and recall is in FDA-regulated foods. Most of us will remember the romaine lettuce about this time of the year. I think, was it 2017, 2018, 2019? And what did we find? It was from central Yuma, Arizona, and from the California coast areas. By the way, Canada has banned import of romaine or any kind of leafy greens from those areas. Okay? But why were these? I mean, it's lettuce. How does lettuce get E. coli? By the way, that's like the third most common question I ever get. What did we find out was the source of E. coli in our leafy greens? Human nature, but specifically that these are all being grown downstream of CAFO operations, where cattle was being fed. We've seen so many outbreaks, cantaloupe, cucumbers, leafy greens, and it's these three items here. I thought there was a pointer. There is a pointer. It's these three items that led to the idea of a produce safety bill in Congress that never really took root. It was ultimately the Food Safety Modernization Act in 2010 that got passed the same legislative session as the Affordable Health Care Act. And it almost didn't happen. The Food Safety Modernization Act literally was passed by Congress at 11:50 p.m. on the last day of the administrative session. So close, and I write about this in my first book, about how there were people like trying to help and monitoring this and literally thinking it was not going to pass. It passed 2010, was signed in 2011 by President Obama, and it took 5 years for the rules to be written. During that period, I traveled around the country with the FDA, going to listening sessions, state after state after state after state. It was an incredible experience. And one of the experiences I want to share is the fact that part of the delay is the fact that at the time, most regulatory policies regarding food were written so much earlier that a lot of the definitions did not apply any longer. They literally had to redefine the word farm. They literally had to redefine the concept of raw agricultural product. They literally had to create words that define that there are some places that are farms where things are grown, and there's other farms that are not really farms by that definition because things aren't grown there. They basically act as a holding place for raw agricultural commodity until it goes into some type of a manufacturer processing kind of a state or packaging. So we not only had to change our definition of various elements related to farming and produce, but we had to look at these different elements. Even recently, the idea of the frozen waffle being contaminated with listeria, we did not look at listeria as being something in frozen items a few years ago. In fact, the Bluebell Creamery's ice cream incident was a shock because no one had ever thought that you could find a pathogen like that in ice cream. And now you're dealing with things like the high lead content because of the cinnamon from Ecuador that's found in applesauce. Quick audience participation. One of these is the deadliest. One of these has killed the most people in any one outbreak. Do we have tomato, lettuce? It is cantaloupe. It is cantaloupe. No one ever thinks about this, but cantaloupe, the USDA spent years trying to figure out how to properly clean the outside and not impact the inside. The pH supports pathogen growth. And what's crazy to me is that I remember a time when you would go to a restaurant and if you ordered a meal for your kid, it would always have a little slice of the cantaloupe with the rind on it. Things have definitely changed. So let's talk about change. Most people are surprised when I tell them Jack in the Box, 1993, responsible for 4 deaths, they came out and said that they knowingly decided to not follow the law that said that here's a minimum cooking temperature for fast food hamburgers because they prioritized customers getting their food 1 minute earlier. Those were the KPIs at the time. No state or federal charges were filed against this company, even though they admitted they broke a law that resulted in 4 people's deaths. Imagine the impact that would have made. Imagine the message it would have sent. We have by the way, again, another thing to look up, 1975 U.S. v. Park, Supreme Court decision from which we get the responsible corporate officer doctrine, which says that specifically a corporate officer, which can be defined as many different things, shall be held strictly and personally liable for failure to take action if they knew that there was a problem. It doesn't mean that they can be punished if an accident happened and they did everything right. But as we'll see here, we had the Jensen Brothers Cantaloupe Farm. 33 people died. 0.15 million, they got 6 months home detention. DeCoster's Eggs, salmonella outbreak, 500 million, with a B, eggs had to be recalled. in the United States. $6.8 million federal fine, and the father and son owners, they served 3 months in federal prison. Now, what's confusing is that this was kind of taking place about the same time as the Peanut Corporation of America. Many people don't know about this. You need to look this up. If any of this is applicable to what you do, you need to look this up. So, you know how, anyone ever go to like Home Depot or Lowe's and they have that area where there's cinder blocks and in between them they have like mulch? Yeah, that's how they were storing their peanut dust until they had enough peanut powder, peanut dust to fill a truck, and then they would ship it to Duncan Hines for the cake mix or all these different companies that use their peanut dust. And they also had a problem with their roof in such that there were holes, and rainwater would bring bird poop down, and there was rats that were getting into there, and the CEO basically said, just sweep it off and ship it anyway. And the QA manager would falsify reports. If they didn't like these results, they'd get another company, see if they had better results for the test, and they'd throw out the bad ones and go with the good ones. And if they couldn't get good ones, well, let's just put it this way. The QA manager, she went to prison for 5 years for one guilty charge. She was called the Queen of Liquid Paper. She would just change the date on the forms and send it off. The CEO, however, went to prison, for 28 years. He was found guilty of almost 100 federal felony charges, including obstruction of justice, because he lied about where this missing plant was. They found the one in Georgia and Virginia, but they couldn't find where the actual source was. I know the previous presenter talked about that wonderful acronym, an aha moment. Here is an aha moment. The hidden peanut production facility, when a whistleblower pointed the Department of Justice and they went to there and found it. By the way, it was found because it was not found earlier because it was not registered with that state. In fact, the investigation found there were over 350 food manufacturing facilities that were not registered with that state. Here's where the irony comes in. They spent 2 years trying to find this facility. Its location, the city of Plainview, Texas. The missing facility was in Plainview. You can't make this up. CEO gets 28 years. His brother, partner, gets 20 years. A couple other people get 3, 5, 6 years. I was in the courtroom at this time. First off, the CEO said, yeah, the Jack in the Box people should have gone to prison. But the shock, not only in the courtroom of 28 years, but the shock that was felt across boardrooms in the food industry and even beyond the food industry was incredible. This was the largest, and since then, it's been the only such time where a corporate officer has been held this liable for their failures. ConAgra pays $11.2 million, no prison time for a failure in 2017. Everyone should recall the recent Chipotle outbreaks. They paid, at the time, record $25 million, no prison. 19.5 for Bluebell Creameries. There was almost prison time for the CEO because he lied to the stock owners. He lied to people about that, but ultimately he got off. All he had to do is pay $100,000. Yes? Oh, I'm sorry. These dates are based, this date right here is based on when the fine was imposed. But yes, the outbreak was much earlier and the sentencing was much earlier. Thank you. You know, I forgot is I put those dates based on when the fine or the jail was done. Thank you for pointing that out. Every once in a while you kind of overlook little details. Yeah, so these dates are based on when the final decision was made. And then recently, Family Dollar stores with their rat infestations. This is recent. Anyone hear about this one? Central Arkansas Distribution Center. Over 3,000 dead rats and live rats and things found in there. $41 million. Now we have to wonder about what's it? Boar's Head. Boar's Head is almost it's almost Family Dollar repeated, kind of a situation. So I'm going to go quickly. I can't talk about all this, but I wanted to make sure we covered. We have innovations in technology, using technology to analyze data, to detect potential hazards. There's transparency, monitoring, smart sensors, and everything being done to prevent contamination. We have challenges of implementing technology. Mostly, it's how we use technology to build trust, but there's also that idea of how we define the return on investment. And there's a disconnect in terms of investors. Investors want a short return on investment, but in food safety, we want a longer form of a return on investment, and those often clash. I want to make sure I cover this. This is a hypothetical model. After an incident in which public becomes aware, this is an outbreak or a recall, we typically see the red dots right here. Most companies do not make a change in terms of what they're doing until there's a change in legislation or litigation, essentially court cases. Yes, there are some companies that make changes early, but the bulk do not make changes until they are legally or politically required to. Over time, liabilities increase, costs increase, and options to mitigate decrease. What we need to shift to is not a reactive situation, but more of a proactive approach. Specifically, we can't predict everything, but if we use technology to try to predict, look at patterns and say, hey, can we predict this before food gets into the market, using evidence and issues, we can essentially maximize our options, the value of those options. We can decrease the costs and decrease, if not eliminate, the liabilities. Much of the talk around blockchain and technologies has been about faster reaction, faster recovery times, faster recalls, faster traceability. If we do not talk about technology in terms of being proactive and trying to predict some of these things, we never will. So my biggest takeaway, I guess, would be if we look at technology, it's hand in hand. Not just reactive, but also proactive, predictive. What can we do about it? Plant-based, the second thing I want to make sure people take away is plant-based food is food. And it's not food unless it's safe food. How many people have flown within the last year? I'm sure you can agree with me. It's not a flight unless it's a safe flight. If it's not a safe flight, it becomes something else. And for too many people, food has become something else. For 30 years, we have held on to the same CDC estimates. 48 million Americans get sick, 128,000 are hospitalized, and 3,000 die every single year due to failures in food safety. I was recently asked, well, is food safer today than it was 30 years ago? I don't think so. I do not think so. I think that food safety, the action, is stronger, better today than it was 30 years ago. But I don't think our food is actually safer than it was 30 years ago, because those numbers would have, even 1% would have made an impact. You realize 1% of 3,000 is essentially a schoolroom class, elementary classroom full of students. The idea that, when I went to the premiere at the Tribeca Film Festival for the documentary in New York, earlier that morning I went to the 9/11 memorial. And here is this memorial, this monument to 3,000 people who died at that time. Every single year, we lose essentially a 9/11 worth of consumers due to failures in food safety. We have to do something better. We have to do something better. We have to look at these. There's a fly. It's crazy, right there. I had more slides to go through, but the idea of safe food should be the only food. We have to look at how we're using advanced testing technologies, advancing our audits and compliance and validation, and how we're using this technology to do such. We need to look at transparency and traceability. It's not just the fact that we're talking about highly processed or ultra-processed foods. It's that if I were to go buy a carrot or a piece of mango, and some of the earliest testing with blockchain for traceability was with mangoes, right? And if you look at the list of ingredients for a mango, and you see the word mango. But if you go and buy most of our FDA-regulated, ready-to-eat, highly processed or ultra-processed foods, like let's say a lasagna at the grocery store, it's probably, 100 and some odd ingredients, half of which we can't even pronounce. Imagine trying to deal with the traceability of any one of those ingredients. Again, now you look at that applesauce and think about where did this get lead content, and who was really thinking about the cinnamon at the time as being the source of the excessive lead content in applesauce. There are some examples out there. IBM's Food Trust Platform, in terms of blockchain technology. We have Watson, even Google, dealing with AI-powered predictive analytics. IoT sensors, many companies are using this, and the idea of using an integrated approach in which all these things are combined. We need to look at the idea of challenges and considerations. The long-term benefits, improved traceability, consumer trust, cost savings, and risk mitigation. But we need to realize that there's challenges. The need for industry-wide standardization, which is the chief reason right now why we don't have as much traceability and digitization within the food industry. Data privacy concerns. The more digitalized, the more information's out there on the internet, the more we're using these technologies, the more we're going to be dealing with concerns over data privacy. And finally, those high upfront costs. In closing, 1906, the jungle. The things described by Mr. Sinclair happened yesterday, are happening today, and will happen tomorrow and the next day until some Hercules comes to cleanse the filthy stable. I don't think that there's actually a Hercules. Instead, I want to say that food safety requires a Herculean effort, an enormous amount of work, strength, and courage. All the technology in the world can help us with our work and strength, but courage cannot be assisted by technology. This is a very human element. And that idea of how we need to partner technology as an incredibly important ingredient with courage with technology in terms of ensuring the safety of plant-based foods. Technology is not the answer, but technology plus courage could be the answer. And with that, I thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Folks, do you have questions? And I will do a shout out. We use that food law in our agribusiness program. All of our students, you'll be happy to hear, use the food law book and are required to take that in the College of Agriculture. So everybody is reading that book that you were an author in.
We have some questions over here. Mike's going.
Sorry, I can't see who has the mic. Okay, can you turn it on and use it? Thanks.
I think it's on. Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm actually from Michigan and state grad. Yeah. Couple different things. I'm a pediatrician, but my husband and I bought a building that had listeria. Actually, that we knew when we bought it for we manufacture our whole food plant-based stuff. And so we were very concerned. We didn't want to be in the MMWR. And so we were like, clean this like crazy. But we know who we bought it from. And every time we look at their food and how they did their process, it's really pretty scary. And the state never held them accountable for those things. But you can buy that food at the grocery store, and then a baba ganoush has raw egg in it for some reason. You know, it's like, why would it be in there? And so that's very scary and frustrating. Co-manufacturing, what do you see? And there's a ton of it. Most of food is co-manufactured, and that's a huge risk in also. So a lot of plant-based foods will say cooked to 160, which shouldn't actually be necessary. 130, 135 should be totally fine. But when I see that, oh my gosh, okay, let me cook the heck out of this food. So I'm just bringing up.
Sure. Really quickly, based on that point, when the McDonald's E. coli that we're now saying it's from the onions became an issue, I was interviewed a great deal, and one of the things I brought up is the fact that I guarantee that the farm and the distribution system that was taking those onions to McDonald's, and by the way, you don't cook the onions, like you don't cook the lettuce, tomato, pickle, and onions, right? So there's no kill step. But the company that was distributing those onions to McDonald's was distributing it elsewhere. So we need to look at places other than McDonald's, and we did find this. There were other restaurants, including IHOP. Now, I bring up IHOP because just recently, there's been evidence to show that, yes, IHOP removed, just like McDonald's, they removed those onions from the kitchen. But they still had E. coli in the kitchen. There are still consumers that are getting sick from E. coli at IHOP, and they got sick after the onions were removed in IHOP from the kitchens. Well, go back to the question I asked earlier, which was, how come these companies are saying they removed it, but they're not saying that they've completely sanitized the facility? Okay, cross-contamination would go to all other products, including those that are not cooked and do not have a kill step, and so they needed to have prioritized not only the conducting of that sanitation, but the communication if they truly want to gain the trust of their consumers. I think someone over here, sorry. How about one and then two?
Well, we need to wrap it up
Yeah.
quickly because
Quickly.
we have our next
Okay,
speaker.
sorry.
Whereas operators and manufacturers, they are responsible and they should be held accountable for their performance and their facilities. But what's the role of the regulatory agencies? You know, in case of Boar's Head, this situation has been going on for quite some time. So where were the health departments? Where were the regulatory agencies that they were expected to inspect those facilities? And so there's nothing, they're not held responsible for what they do.
Well, but realize that A, the FDA has no inspections and has never done inspections. The FDA leaves it up to the state. State only has so much resources, and every state's different. So even when a state does an annual follow-up, and by the way, I think much of what we saw, like with Boar's Head and a lot of these situations, are because of the pandemic. And one might say, well, that was a while ago. What's that have to do with it? The in-person inspections decreased radically as a result of the pandemic, and they were just done over Zoom calls. And there's too many companies that basically got very relaxed in terms of their sanitation. By the way, they outsource most of that. And by the way, much of that is outsourced to a company that employs underage minors and illegal immigrants. So these same companies are violating child labor laws. And then you wonder, why would they violate food safety laws? Well, they had no problem violating child labor laws. I'm editorializing. Anyway, the point being is that, you know, we typically don't look at the idea of an outbreak or a recall until after someone gets harmed. It is so reactive. Rarely do we find things in advance. In fact, 30 years of looking at this, and I've never found a situation. The closest I've seen is the Bluebell Creamery, because it was an accident that was tested, and they ultimately found that there were people who got sick with it because they were in the hospital and they were eating shakes or milkshakes or whatever, that had that ice cream, and they did not enter with listeria, but while they were a patient, now they had listeria. And it was tied back to Bluebell Creamery. So that was the only, in 30 years, the only case I've seen where it was an outbreak that was found before there were victims. Anyway, I'm sure I'm out of time. I'll be around if you have more questions, but thank you very, very much. And again, it's not any kind of food unless it's safe food.